Okay, so welcome to tonight's webinar on Can Natural Flood Management Help Protect Chesterfield from Floods? Thanks for all joining on such a gorgeous evening. My name's Lisa. I'm going to be chairing tonight's session. We have two really experienced and knowledgeable speakers tonight, Debbie Coldwell from Catchment Rivers Trust and Ian Davis, who's a member of the Nature Friendly Farmers Network. But before I introduce them, I was going to pass over to Steph to give just a short introduction about the Chesterfield and District Flood Action Group. So the two speakers will speak for about half an hour, 35 minutes, and then there'll be a chance for Q&A, and we'll ask you to sort of just, put your hands up either hopefully electronically if you can find that at the bottom. It's under I think it's under React, isn't it? Um, and then we'll finish at 8:15. So, Steph, can I pass to you to say a few words about the Flood Action Group?
Hello, it's great to see everybody here. The Flood Action Group has only been in existence a few weeks. Some of us came together. No, some of us know each other for a long time. I know Lisa and Brian, and we've been climate activists in Chesterfield for a long time. And we were started the year sort of thinking, what should we be focusing on? When we saw the Derbyshire Times was all about floods, we thought we had a demonstration or anything of that sort, we should talk to some of the flood victims and what their feelings were. And we knew some. So we started by having a conversation with the flood victims. And since then, we've been on a really steep learning curve, finding out about what causes flooding and what can be done about it, what effects it has. And we started with talking to the Environment Agency, which was very informative, and decided to go from there to talking to about natural flood management, which we understand has big contribution to make to preventing floods. So that's why we're here. That's how we got here. As I say, it's been very rapid growth of a group.
Okay, thank you, Steph. Right, so without further ado, I'll pass to our first speaker, Debbie. If you want to start sharing your screen, and I'll introduce you while you're doing that, Debbie. So Debbie's a Natural Flood Management Officer with the Catchment Rivers Trust, which is a river conservation charity that aims to protect, enhance and restore the rivers of the Catchment and reconnect people back to the rivers. And Debbie's been with them for about 5 years, and she heads up a project in the Upper Rother Catchment that aims to reduce flood risk in and around Chesterfield area. So, oh, Debbie, your screen, you were sharing then, it's disappeared.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
Unusual thing of where it worked fine before, and now it's
Yeah.
I'll just try and get
Okay.
it back.
You had it a minute ago.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm, Here we go.
there we go. That looks like
Okay.
it's okay. Yep. Do you want to do full screen?
Yep. There we go. Hopefully that's it
Yeah.
properly now.
Lovely. Yeah. Thank you. You can start.
Great. Okay, let me just shift things around a bit on my screen to make sure I can see everything. There we go. Great. Thank you so much for having me. Really good to be here this evening. Yeah, like has already been said, very much appreciate people coming when it's such a nice evening out there. So yeah, I'm just going to give a bit of a brief background on the Catchment Rivers Trust for those of you that don't know us already. I'll then focus in more on the flooding, on what natural flood management is and the kind of work that we do at the Trust to help reduce flood risk. And then, yeah, we'll hopefully have a bit more time to go in more depth during the Q&A. So DCRT is a charity. We are one of 65 rivers trusts across the UK and Ireland, with each trust looking after a particular catchment area. And we look after the Don catchment, which is shown here on the map. So you can see it's quite a large area that includes Chesterfield down in the south of the catchment, as well as Sheffield, Rotherham, Barnsley, Doncaster, and then all the way out to Goole. There are 11 of us that work at the trust, as well as our trustees. And then we also have a fantastic group of volunteers who we are very lucky to work with, some of whom are on the call this evening. And our overarching aim at the Trust is to protect and restore the rivers of the Catchment, which encompasses a whole suite of different activities. And it's not just directly on the rivers themselves, but in the sort of wider landscape, as so much of what we do in that wider landscape ultimately impacts the rivers themselves. In brief, this includes direct restoration of rivers, so improving habitat, doing works to improve fish passage. We also do a lot of work with people, communities and schools. We collect evidence and data, and we encourage partnership working across the wider catchment to be able to deliver more and better results. We also work with a variety of landowners, supporting land management and delivery of natural flood management by working with nature, which is obviously the focus of the talk. So as we look more into flooding, it is worth remembering that flooding is a natural phenomenon. Rivers have and always will flood in certain areas, but flooding is now happening more regularly and at greater intensities than would be expected under normal circumstances, both in the UK and wider, so globally. Something that we'll obviously all be very much aware of on this call. And very sadly, Chesterfield has not escaped this. Obviously, Storm Babette in October 23 being the latest incident to bring such devastation to many in the area. My heart really goes out to you if you were affected by the floods. So there's multiple factors that contribute to this increased flood risk that we're experiencing. But just to touch briefly on two of the kind of key factors, the first obviously being climate change. So we're already experiencing and are predicted to experience more intense periods of rainfall as a result of climate change. But also land use and management. So obviously the way we've built up our towns and cities now, we have a lot of hard surfaces preventing water from being absorbed into the ground and instead rushes over those surfaces into our drainage networks and rivers, which can become overwhelmed. So we've also drastically altered our rural landscapes, removing a lot of the natural features like woodlands, wetlands that previously have helped capture and absorb water before they reach our river networks. And we have a lot of compacted soils in the rural environment as well, which again can just cause water to kind of rush off the surface instead of being soaked up. So yeah, as I say, climate change and land use change, both big drivers of increased flood risk. Traditionally, we've tackled flooding by using sort of hard engineered flood defences, so your flood walls, floodgates. And though these are essential really in protecting many of our towns and cities, we can't really just keep on building bigger and bigger walls. It's just not sustainable. And there are other methods of addressing flood risk that need to be used in combination with these traditional flood defences, one of which is natural flood management. So just a little bit of background on natural flood management, or NFM, for those of you that haven't really come across it before. Natural flood management is a way of working with nature to reduce the risk of flooding. So it aims to protect and put back a lot of those natural features that we've lost, and to restore and mimic natural processes that capture and slow the flow of rainfall and runoff, so it's not just rushing off into the streams and rivers all at the same time during a storm. So NFM covers a whole suite of different types of measures and interventions, and generally these aim to sort of slow the flow of water or store water, increase infiltration of water into soils, and hold back sediment, which could otherwise be sort of washed off during high rainfall and cause blockages, which then leads to flooding. So there's a lot of different examples of what these kind of measures are and what they look like on the ground. But to just give you a bit of a sort of overview of what some of them are, it can be things like putting the wiggles back into our rivers. So obviously a lot of our rivers have been straightened, so just putting the bends in, slowing the water down. Putting leaky barriers into streams. So these are sort of big timbers that you put across the brook, allows the water to back up behind them during a storm and it gets temporarily stored. Creating storage ponds, planting trees, hedgerows, woodlands that slow the flow of water through the landscape and allow it to be absorbed into the water. Into the soil beneath the trees, which tends to be much spongier, so can act as a big sort of sponge for water. There's also a variety of different ways that we can improve soil health, so reducing that compaction that I was talking about, and increasing how much water the soils can absorb. For natural flood management to be effective, we need to have the right measures in the right places, often throughout a landscape. So it might look a little something like this image here. Don't worry about the labels and stuff. But where you'd have kind of woodlands throughout the landscape, lots of different sort of storage ponds, leaky barriers on the streams, allowing the rivers to flood where it's safe to do so by removing embankments, having that good soil management and so on. And if done well, then NFM can help to reduce flood peaks. So that's the greatest amount of water moving through a river during a flood. And it can delay the time it takes for floodwaters to reach populated areas, giving people more time to prepare and to get to safety. So something we particularly heard from people about Babette was just how quickly the water rose for a lot of people. So, just giving them that bit more time to get to safety and move things out of the way. And it can also help to reduce the pressure on other flood defences so that these can still function as intended during a flood. But it is important to note that just how effective natural flood management is at achieving sort of all of these sort of flood risk benefits. It does vary. There are lots of different factors that influence how much of an impact that NFM can have. There is increasing evidence and confidence that natural flood management can achieve these reductions in flood risk, particularly at a local scale, so where you have your NFM measures close to your at-risk areas, and also particularly effective in smaller scale floods. When it comes to the really big flood events, so your 1 in 100-year events and bigger, we don't have as much evidence. It's much harder to get that evidence during those big storms. And what evidence we do have suggests that it might not be as effective. But we are still very much kind of gathering that evidence and trying to understand if and what can be done to improve that impact. But as I say, it does vary very much between different projects that have been done. And it can be the difference between giving people that more time and, stopping properties from flooding. So it is worth reiterating, as I kind of mentioned before, that NFM won't necessarily solve all flooding, but it can be a really important part of the toolkit. It's also worth noting that NFM can deliver many other benefits as well. So NFM measures help to improve water quality by filtering out pollutants before they reach our rivers, for example. NFM can also help capture carbon. So if you think particularly about your woodlands and wetlands, so helping reduce climate change impacts in the first place. And because they retain water in the landscape for longer, they can also help during times of drought, which we're also expected to experience more as a result of climate change. And they can create really valuable wildlife habitat and increase amenity value for people. So hopefully that's given you that bit of background and overview of kind of what we're talking about when we refer to NFM. I'll just go into a little bit more now about my role and the work that we've been doing. So I work in the Upper Rother Catchment shown in the map here, which sort of spreads from Claycross in the south up through Chesterfield to sort of Eckington area in the north. And the aim of my role is to raise awareness about NFM, support delivery of NFM, and work with local landowners, communities, and volunteers. So I'm just going to sort of go through a few examples or case studies of some of the projects that we've done. So we've been working in various country parks across Chesterfield. Sort of the biggest scheme that we've done in the country parks was at Grassmoor. So this is the slope the flow to the Callow. I always get it wrong. And for anyone that doesn't know it, this is about 2 miles southeast of Chesterfield. And essentially all the water that lands on the park or flows through the park finds its way into the Callow Brook, which then flows into the Spittal Brook, which then joins the Rother near Hornsbridge roundabout. So obviously being a country park, there's a lot of space to hold water. So we worked with what the park was already doing to enhance the amount of water that could be stored in the park during heavy rain, largely by creating multiple storage ponds that capture either runoff or flows from the streams that run through the park. But we also did some tree planting and some meadow sowing as well. So the picture the pictures here show, yeah, some of those water storage areas. The top one takes runoff from sort of the surrounding area, and it gets stored, as you can see behind, well, you can just about make out, hopefully there's an embankment on the right hand side. So that allows the water to back up behind it and stores it there for longer than it used to. And then it slowly drains back down towards the brook. Sorry, that jumped back for some reason. And then the lower picture shows water that comes from a nearby stream. So water backs up when we get a lot of rain, and it flows then into these storage areas that are created, fills up the first one, then drains down into the second one, and then that slowly drains into an area where we planted woodland, and then that drains into the brook again and then back out. So all of these storage areas are basically just holding water back when we have a big storm, prevents it all from flowing down towards central Chesterfield all at the same time as all the other sort of tributaries. So yeah, the new features together have created about 1,500 cubic meters of water storage within the park, which is the same as about 1.5 million litres, or if it helps you to picture it better, 2.6 million pints. And though this is a large volume of water, on its own, this scheme won't necessarily have a huge impact on flood risk downstream, but it's a bit of a demonstrator for what can be done, and will hopefully help pave the way for more of these kind of projects so we can build up that cumulative effect of having multiple NFM features in the landscape. We also did a lot of really brilliant community engagement as part of this project, which was supported by the Friends of Grasmore Country Park, who were great to work with. And yeah, sadly not got time to go into all of that, but it was a really enjoyable part of the project. We also work with farmers, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because obviously we've got much more of an expert in the next speaker. So I won't go into detail other than to say that we support farmers with measures on their land that are beneficial for their businesses, as well as delivering a suite of environmental benefits, including slowing the flows of water through things like improved soil management, planting and managing hedgerows, creating field corner ponds, building leak barriers, woodland planting, and so on. And another example is in private woodlands at Newfield Springwoods in the Moss Valley. So here, together with volunteers from the Trust and friends and volunteers of Newfield Springwood, we've put in over 60 leaky barriers throughout the 12-hectare woodland of various shapes and sizes, as you can hopefully see from the photos. And the idea behind all of these, again, is that they just interrupt the flow of water through the woods, stops it all from rushing off down into the Moss Brook at the same time. And we have these sort of larger leaky barriers in the bottom two photos that are on the main tributary that runs through the woods. And then we also have a lot of smaller sort of leaky barriers in the ditches that run through the woods, and hazel hurdles, like you can see in the top right-hand picture, across where we get sort of overland flows through the woods. So these all cause the water to back up behind them, pushes that out into the woods a bit more, and temporarily stores and slows the movement of water through the woods. And all of the work that's been done there has been done using materials from the woods in line with the woodland management plan. And final example I just want to mention, because it's a little bit different from a lot of the other stuff that we do really, is these rain garden planters. So very much like a water butt, these will attach to your downpipe. So all of the rain that lands on the roof is then diverted into the planter. So it waters the plants, and then it soaks down through the soil and down into a sort of storage chamber at the bottom, which slowly then drains back into the original downpipe. So again, it's just a way of kind of slowing that water down from getting into the drainage network. And yeah, if you have enough of these on enough buildings, then it can build up to a significant amount of water that's held back. And these are ones that we've literally just put in yesterday at Homebrook Valley Park on the pavilion building there. And we've got funding to do a couple more. And these were funded through the Chesterfield Borough Community Grant Scheme. So we're just looking at a few more buildings at the minute to work out where these next ones are going to go. And we're hoping to keep this rolling and bring in more funding for more of these in other places, and hopefully also inspire businesses, and you can get kind of smaller versions for homes, and things like that. So hopefully inspire other people to think about these kind of measures. So hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour for the kind of work that we do. Currently, quite a bit of my time is focused on work in the north of the catchment, so around Eckington and Renishaw. But we're also starting to build up a catalogue of opportunities in the Hipper catchment, and we're doing some work with Derbyshire Wildlife Trust in this area at the moment as well. I did just want to say that, it will take time. I know it's not what people want to hear when they're worrying about their homes. But we do have to sort of apply and bring in funding for feasibility and then for delivery, and certain measures can take time to mature and function, particularly sort of the trees and woodlands. But it does really feel like momentum is building around NFM, and that it's increasingly being recognised as a part of the sustainable response to help with flood risk. And a really key sort of step for us is building up relationships with landowners in the area who are willing to have these measures on their land. So if anybody does have any land that you think might be suitable, or contacts of people, or just ideas of where you think there might be room or space or that would make sense, then please do get in touch, and we'd be happy to kind of explore those. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now, and yeah, hopefully get some good questions and look at things in a bit more detail shortly.
Thank you very much, Debbie. That was a very clear overview with lots of good practical examples. So, Ian, if you want to start sharing your screen, and I'll introduce you while you're doing that. So, we'll take questions after Ian's presentation. So, Ian's a member of the Nature Friendly Farmers Network. He's got a very illustrious background. Joined the National Rivers Authority in 1991, managing river maintenance and flood incident response across North London, Herts, and Essex. And he then joined the Environment Agency and contributed to several national research and development projects, and was operational flood risk lead for the 2012 London Olympic Park, and resumed full-time farming in 2015, as completed the Savoury Holistic Management training. And he's got lots of letters after his name. So, Ian, you're very welcome. And would you like to start your presentation? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, I farmed for 40 years, second generation farmer, in the North London area, and as a result of the BSE crisis in 1989, mad cow disease, for anyone who remembers all of that, started looking for work, and fell into managing rivers, which I then did alongside farming for 23 years. So I have a foot in both camps, both the Environment Agency and public sector management, and one very firmly in farming, and see things from both sides of the fence. So it puts me in an unusual position. I quickly do a little bit about my background, although the introductions covered it fairly well. And then I'll split my talk into two separate sections. One about the process around floods, the bureaucratic process around floods, and why everything takes so long, and then go on to farmers' thoughts on nature-based solutions to flooding. So, where did I do my work? Well, hopefully you can see my pointer moving on the screen. This black line here is London. And all of these fancy coloured bits are separate parts of the catchments that I worked in. Essentially, I spent 20 years managing this piece up the top, the green and yellow bits with a few red bits up the top, and then was persuaded to take over the whole of East London, or effectively the eastern side of that map that you can see there. For the last 3 years, I worked there. So covered both rural areas and intense urban areas. So first, seems a strange thing to start off with, but what do you call a watercourse? I pulled these two up looking at the Chesterfield area. This is the map that you can use to check areas at risk of flooding. And you can clearly see here, you've got the River Hipper, and I can't remember the name of the brook coming in here, showing quite clearly. When you look at the Environment Agency's main river map, the river stops up, doesn't extend all the way up the River Hipper. And the brook coming in doesn't show at all. And that's an important distinction in who does what. So essentially in English law, if it's marked on the main river map in blue, it's defined as main river, and it's as basic as that. Rivers can be enmained or demained. If it's not a main river, it's ordinary watercourse, or there is a third category called public sewers, which are managed by the water companies, but they're generally culverted out of sight. What difference does this mean? Well, the important legislation around flooding goes back to Land Drainage Act 1991 and Water Resources Act 1991. If it's main river, it falls under the Water Resources Act. If it's ordinary watercourse, it falls under the Land Drainage Act. One of them makes the local authority responsible. One of them makes the Environment Agency responsible. And then that was updated by the Floods and Water Management Act of 2010, which created a role for lead local flood authorities, which are generally the county councils. So if it's main river, it falls to the Environment Agency. They have an overall duty of supervision of those watercourses. They have a duty to provide flood risk monitoring and flood warnings, and they have a management role for the flood events. There's a key difference to recognise between duties and powers. The Environment Agency has powers to do works to rivers to prevent flooding, but a power is discretionary. So in times like we've had now for a very long time, when budgets are short, it's up to the agency whether they actually do the work at any particular location. The only exception to that is the few places where the agency owns a river. And then if the state of the river is causing properties to flood, then there may be a legal obligation on them to do the work. A legal duty is something you can't get out of. But as I say, the only duties that the Environment Agency has for flooding are an overall duty of supervision, and it's never really been bottomed out in case law exactly what that means, and a duty to provide a flood warning service. And then riparian ownership's worth mentioning, because anyone who owns land that adjoins a river is defined as a riparian owner, and there are some responsibilities that come along with that. So Debbie's quite accurately said earlier that floods are a natural process. They've always happened and they always will. Everyone's aware of all of the emergency services chasing around during a flood. The recovery phase and what happens next is the bit that really matters for anyone who's been through flooding. Once you've been flooded, what's going to happen next? Well, there's an awful lot of work that still has to be done. There's recording the flooding that's happened, gathering data from all over the place, and then if it's felt that the damage exceeded what was expected, or the number of properties, whether commercial or residential, were flooded badly can justify it, then it moves into a flood investigation. That in itself is a long, drawn-out process, which I'm sure some of you in Chesterfield are already finding. Essentially, the relevant body, whether it's lead local flood authority for ordinary watercourse or the Environment Agency for main river watercourse, has to satisfy themselves that they understand how the flood happened, and then set about trying to design a way to mitigate that flood in future if they feel that it was of a scale that shouldn't have actually flooded properties. Because we're moving into a situation with climate change where we're getting such extreme rainfall that there will be some properties in some situations that are not economically defendable against flooding. And that's a really difficult discussion that's ongoing. It's been going on between the government and the insurance industry for quite some time now. No one's really grasped that nettle for the highest risk properties. Natural flood management comes into this because it started coming in just as I was leaving the Environment Agency in 2014. It's a way of trying to reduce the likelihood of flooding for properties at a much lower cost and in a way that delivers all of the additional benefits that Debbie was talking about. So, a combination of my views as a farmer and views as a flood risk professional. Farming has, the way we've done it in the UK, has exacerbated flooding in the UK. We changed our catchments quite considerably during and after the Second World War, and for the period from then through until the early to mid 2000s. An awful lot of land drainage was done, trying to make more land suitable to grow a different range of crops. Certainly during the Second World War, there was a lot of grassland that was ploughed up to try and grow potatoes and wheat and things like that to provide necessary food for the country. And none of that land, or very little of that land, was ever put back afterwards. It stayed in cultivation and in order to produce human food. That has impacts on how the water actually moves through the catchment. If you drain land, by definition, you're getting the water off it quicker. And if you're getting it off quicker, then it's entering the river quicker, and you must be increasing the peak flow of the river to some degree. How much impact it has will depend on how big an area is drained and how quickly it drains, but there is an effect there. Debbie's right to say as well, tillage and compaction. At the end of the Second World War, very few farms, farms were starting to use tractors, but there was still a lot of work done at that stage with horses. My father caught the tail end of working with horses. But over the time since then, farm equipment has got so much bigger and so much heavier. We cause a lot more compaction to farm soils now than we used to. And when a soil is heavily compacted, water finds it much harder to penetrate into the surface. There's also been chemical changes to the soils. It's now appreciated that using chemical fertilizers, which are essential to grow the yields of food that we do these days, it actually impacts on the chemistry of the topsoil in a way that causes a loss of a lot of the aggregation in the soil, which provides the spaces in the soil that allow water to percolate through quickly, which then means that you have to spend more time and more effort removing the compaction from the soil. And also, we tend to leave a lot more bare soil, which means that the water runs over the surface faster, because if you've got crop soil or crop residue on the surface of the land, then it tends to slow the flow of water and to give it more time to soak in. So farming's certainly made a difference. Debbie's quite usefully gone through the range of natural flood management forms available, and I've just pinched, literally while she was doing it, Debbie's picture, because it's a really good one. Looking at that from a farmer's point of view, it depends what you're trying to do with the land. And there's clearly some cultivated areas showing in here, the approach that's been taken to growing human food crops and animal food crops over the last 50 or 60 years has very much been one in the UK of trying to use bigger and bigger equipment to be more and more efficient and to make the fields bigger and more open to give us more space to use that big equipment. That has implications for how that land performs when it rains. In particular, cultivating up and down a slope encourages the water to run straight down the slope very quickly. It's generally considered to be good agricultural practice if you must cultivate a slope, to cultivate along the slope, across the slope, rather than up and down it. But it's much more difficult to do that. So quite often people don't. There's been an awful lot of hedgerows taken out over the years, and a lot less trees in the landscape than there were, and those all make a big difference to the way the water finds its way through the landscape. And with modern machinery, trees dotted around in the landscape make life very difficult for getting in and out with equipment. So there's a balancing act to be met there in terms of a landscape that works for agriculture and a landscape that works for water and for the environment as well. And it's been recognised very strongly now that we've gone too far in one direction. The government shift in emphasis over the last 10 years or so from straight agricultural subsidy to agricultural payment for public goods, which has been accelerated under the Labour government recently, is very much based on that. Why should farmers be paid just for owning land? What they're now looking at is paying farmers very much for delivering specified benefits to the wider public. And flood mitigation is part of that. So we're starting to see farms thinking more about integrating the sort of things that Debbie was talking about back into the landscape. It can be done. It does involve some trade-offs at a farm level. I've stolen a couple of slides from an excellent webinar that I saw 4 or 5 years ago now by Mark Wilkinson from the James Hutton Institute, talking about a lot of research work that they've done on different forms of natural flood management on farmland, and actually trying to quantify the benefits that it does provide. And he makes the point here that we're expecting developments in urban areas to attenuate flood runoff as part of development, getting planning permission for development these days. Essentially, natural flood management means expecting the same thing of farms, and there's no reason why we shouldn't really do that. And this looks quite similar in some ways to Debbie's picture as well, but he's making the point here that just pulling your management back from the edge of the watercourse all the time and leaving a buffer strip, which can be vegetated all year round, can itself, at the very least, reduce soil being eroded and washed into the watercourses. It can also intercept nutrient runoff. There's a problem with excessive nutrients in our watercourses, leading to algal blooms and pollution of watercourses, and that can be mitigated by these riparian buffers. But it does, from the farmer's point of view, mean that you're losing cropped area. So there has to be some sort of a recognition of that in order for it to be attractive to farms to take part in these things. So the real downsides of adopting natural flood management on a farm, the obvious one is loss of productive area, because with the exception of blocking very, very small watercourses, they all involve some sort of loss of productive area. Cost of the works, as to who's actually paying for the works, where there's a joint project of the sorts that Debbie's talking about, then the cost is generally either shared or funded by a third party. So the farm contributes to the land, but the cost of the works isn't actually on the picked up by the farm. But the difficult one on all of these is liability once the work's complete, because it's possible to fundraise to pay for having these works done. It's very difficult to find sources of funding to cover long-term maintenance of them. And the risk is that effectively the farmer agrees, yes, we'll give up some land for this. We'll allow other people to come in and repurpose that land. But then over a period of time, we're the ones that are expected to pick up the maintenance cost of it. And if that's not resolved properly, then that can make it very difficult to get farmers to actually come on board with this. Having said that, I've hardly come across a farmer who, when you ask them what their purpose for the farm is, doesn't at some point in the conversation say that we should be leaving the farm in a better state than we found it. The problem is that over the years, our definition of a better state has changed. For a long period, it was more productive. It was producing greater yields. Now we're starting to rebalance that, and leaving the farm in a better state is something that natural flood management can actually be part of. And so I think the opportunity is there for farmers to be on side for this, but it's got to be very much a partnership approach. I'll leave it at that. In case anyone's interested, I have, let's have a look at one. I'll wait till I'm not sharing my screen anymore. I will post in the chat a link to the webinar that I was talking about. It lasts for an hour. It's well worth watching if anyone wants to know an awful lot more about the measurement and the research work that's been going on natural flood management. And it's one of a whole series of webinars that you can get to from that YouTube link if you really want to know more about it. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was a very helpful clarification, more the legal definitions and duties and things, and interesting to get a farmer's perspective, which we don't hear very often. So thank you very much for that. So we'll open it up for Q&A now. So if you don't mind raising your hand, if you go to the react button, there is a raise hand thing, which is helpful. If you can't find that, you can just wave, but I don't think I can see everybody on the. Oh, I think I can. No, I can't see everybody on the screen at once. So it's helpful if you can put your hand up. So if anybody would like to ask a question, I know there's quite a few people on this call who have been, affected by catastrophic flooding. I know a lot of people who live in Derbyshire are always at the risk of that. So if anybody's got any questions for Debbie and Ian, now is your chance. Can't see answers. I've just got a question very quickly before we get there. Steph sent me a link to a government, it's a program of flood and coastal erosion risk management schemes, 2-year investment of 2.65 billion in flood and coastal erosion risk. And this isn't necessarily natural flood management, or some it may be, but I had a look at that list and there were 3 Chesterfield sort of Northeast Derbyshire schemes on that. But that's not natural flood management, is it, Debbie? Is that all sort of, big stuff?
It's a mix, I think. I think there are some NFM ones in there. I think the majority of them are sort of more typical traditional flood defences, but there are some NFM ones in there.
Okay, that's good. Okay, anybody got any questions? I'll put that link in the chat. if anybody wants to have a look at that. As I said, there are 3 around Chesterfield, and there are others, particularly around Derby. I think there were quite a few as well. Steph, did you want
And
to?
I just wanted to say, if you ask a question, it would be really useful to know if you're coming from the point of view of someone who's been affected by flood or from some other point of view, whether you represent a group or a profession or anything. It would be helpful to know. Thank you.
Okay, great. And also just say your name and where you're from. Laura, would you like to ask your question if you unmute?
Hello, I'm from Matlock. I know some of you here, and I just nobody's mentioned the B word.
The
I can
beaver.
mention the B word.
So I just wondered whether or not that comes into play at all. Are we going to talk about it as a natural sort of flood defence management sort of system? It has been mentioned in government, though, hasn't it?
Yeah, I can start, and then Ian, if
Thank
you want
you.
to say anything, do jump in. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think beavers, if anybody isn't sure what bee we're talking about, I presume it's beavers. Just double check, Laura, before I waffle on about beavers. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so I definitely think of beavers as part of the kind of natural flood management sort of, yeah, one of the measures that can be used. Again, the evidence around the impacts of beavers is growing all the time. And obviously, we've had a recent change in legislation recently from going from beavers having to be released in enclosed areas, so having to be fenced in, to now wild releases are allowed. So they no longer have to be released into enclosures. But there is still a long process to go through before it's not just a case of now we can just release beavers everywhere. There's still a long process of being granted a license in order to allow them to be released in an area. But yeah, I mean, I know there are still concerns around potential conflicts, particularly with farming and beavers and other conflicts as well. But for me, I do feel like they should absolutely be part of the solution. The evidence is quite clear that they can generally have a bigger impact on flooding than what we can in trying to be beavers. So we build a lot of those leak barriers, but they're nowhere near as effective as beaver barriers, as a beaver dam. So yeah, I think it's all about making sure there's a management system in place for dealing with conflicts that do arise with beavers, and some of the trial beaver projects that have been running, have got those measures in place so that they can resolve conflicts. And yeah, there are studies going on in both Derbyshire and South Yorkshire, the sort of feasibility stages of beaver studies looking into that, and we are engaging with those projects. So yeah, there's no exciting news at the moment, I'd say, but yeah, beavers are definitely being considered as part of the solution.
Ian, did you want to say anything from a farming perspective?
Yeah, a lot of farmers are very concerned about beavers because by their very definition, they'll go where they want to go, and they will impact on the rivers wherever they do go. They certainly offer the opportunity to do an awful lot of river re-engineering without cost, without cost in terms of getting the works done to change the flow of the river. There is a cost, though, of course, if they're causing land to flood that would otherwise be productive. And that's where it all gets very, very difficult. So you will have, there are some farmers out there who've actually been part of introducing beavers. Derek Gow down in Devon has been a very keen proponent of beavers right from the very start. In some of the early work was done on his place. And I know a few farms that have gone out of their way to get beavers onto their farms. But yeah, there's an awful lot of concern within the farming community about beavers turning up and ravaging riverside trees. That's the way it's sort of seen as it would happen. blocking watercourses and flooding fields that are otherwise productive, and who's going to pick up the cost of that. Yeah, it's a very contentious issue in the farming community. Personally, I can see an awful lot of benefits to having beavers in our rivers, but I think we've got to learn how to manage the conflicts that they cause, and I'm not sure that we're going to do that very easily. I have some concerns that beavers have been intentionally released into some of the rivers in London, because I think it's only a matter of time before we see beavers quite naturally obstructing some of the rivers down there, which are in close proximity to properties, and putting commercial and residential property at risk. And then it's going to be interesting to see who steps in to manage that.
Okay, lots of issues there. Thanks for putting your hands up. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I'm just going to address those before I come to you, Brian. Carl, you got a question on stormwater. I don't know if you want to ask that. I'm not sure which Carl it was, actually. Whichever Carl it was. Carl Barrow, yeah.
Yeah, the question was about soakaways in residential areas. Actually, I'm just wondering how much of this floodwater could be diverted just by insisting either through planning that or other means that excess water is held in residential areas in soakaways rather than going into drains.
I don't know if Debbie or Ian wants to have a go at that.
Can I start on that one?
Yeah.
I really ought to check it. It's just something that I've heard said so many times, but the phrase that I heard quoted time and time and time again in the EA was an inch of water on an acre of ground is 100,000 gallons of water. But every time an inch of rain falls, for every acre of land, you've got 100,000 gallons of water going somewhere. If that's a hard surface, then that 100,000 gallons is going to go straight into the nearest watercourse. And if there's any sort of slope on it, then it's going to go very, very quickly. The whole point of SUDS is to try and slow that down, to try and have the absolute minimum amount of hard surface that we need, rather than putting tarmac down all over the place. For example, our car at home is parked on a reinforced area that's got gravel on top, so at least water can soak straight through that still. So although we've gained car parking, we haven't accelerated the runoff from it. But there's always going to be a limit to how much you can achieve with SUDS in the heaviest of rainfall, simply because the capacity of the system will be overcome. And also, with any urban SUDS scheme, it needs maintaining. Eventually, the pores that the water does filter through, in whatever form you lay down, will start to block up, and there will be some need for maintenance to keep it flowing. And I've seen an awful lot of SUDS ponds on the edge of commercial developments or alongside of roadways where new road schemes have gone through and things like that, which are in desperate need of maintaining and no longer provide the benefit they originally did, because the capacity is being lost through silt or big reed beds forming or something like that. And it's a difficult issue because it's something that the maintaining bodies cut back on in times of austerity, as we've been having. But sooner or later, someone's got to start picking up that maintenance.
Okay, thanks. Debbie, did you want to add anything, or?
I'm just having a bit of a complete brain fuzz moment, and because Ian, do you know, wasn't planning regulation changed recently to enforce a certain amount of SUDS? I was just trying to look it up quickly, but I've not managed to find it. Have I made that up?
I'm not sure what the standard is now. Certainly, back when I left in 2014, for greenfield development, we were starting on the assumption that the runoff rate after the development should be no higher than it was
Yeah.
before. But I think that's been stepped up now as a result of climate change, as a recognition of climate change and the fact that our rainfall patterns are changing.
Yeah.
But I'd have to go away and look it up.
Yeah, similar. But yeah, I know there's definitely issues around sort of adoption of SUD schemes on new developments, and that's part of the problem. But I feel like there was a change in the legislation. But as I say, apologies, I've got a slight brain fuzz moment. I can't quite remember what it is, but yeah.
Yeah, seems like a bit of a no-brainer. There's a very good SUD scheme in Sheffield, Greater Green, Modern Sheffield City Council. Okay, Brian, do you go next?
Okay. Well, there was a question. I thought you were going to ask Helen about her question, but I've got a feeling it's about the same topic that I'm going to ask anyway. Obviously, we're not here to deal with exactly with the terrible issues that a number of people and households have in Chesterfield regarding the way the Rother behaved in 2023. But I wonder if maybe Debbie's got a take on this idea that Helen has asked, what about dredging the waterways? I was one of the people that did a lot of leafleting for this meeting, and I visited an area of garage owners, not garage owners, sort of people working on cars in small lock-up garages for their livelihoods. And a whole row of them, one after the other, and they'd had 3 feet deep, 4 feet deep water in their workshops. One after another of them said this would have been prevented if the river had been dredged. And, you know, Debbie hasn't mentioned it because obviously it's a short-term issue, really, isn't it? I mean, if that actually works and it saves all those people on Tapton Terrace and on the people I met on Spittle Lane who had another 3 feet of water in their kitchens, if it actually works, what's wrong with it?
So it's a really good question, Helen, because it always comes up whenever there's a big flood. Dredging always comes up, and I think there's been it's difficult to kind of get the information out there well enough and clear enough, but there is a lot of evidence that says, despite the kind of obviousness of what it seems like how it should help, that actually dredging wouldn't necessarily make that much of a difference. There are certain circumstances where, yes, dredging can be part of the solution. But in a lot of cases, if you actually think about kind of the amount of water you've got in a river compared to the amount of water that we've got coming down when we have these really large scale events, unfortunately, dredging wouldn't necessarily have that much of an impact. I know, and again, Ian, you'll probably be able to comment on this better than me, but the Environment Agency does do studies to look at kind of what impacts dredging could have in certain situations. So it is considered, but for the most part, certainly from my understanding from things that I've read, dredging unfortunately isn't going to have that much of an impact. The other sort of issue, if maybe there was an argument to say, well, there's no harm in doing it, let's just do it anyway and see. But in terms of kind of changing river dynamics, it can potentially make things worse because you sort of encourage the flow of water to move more quickly through that bit of river, removing habitat, removing sort of, resistance within the river. So you're just kind of pushing the problem further downstream. I think that's all kind of part of the argument, and obviously just has huge impacts in terms of just kind of a natural river and sort of wildlife and other features within a river if you dredge it. As I say, there are certain circumstances where dredging could potentially help, but for the most part, I don't believe that it's thought to be that useful. But Ian,
Yeah,
you come in.
It's a regular question, this one. When I joined the National Rivers Authority in 1991, if we saw silt in a river, we would add it to our list of potential sites to take the silt out of. And across the area I worked for, we kept 3 tracked excavators working permanently, taking silt out of rivers. A few years later, the approach to it was starting to change, and we adopted a system which I'm pretty sure happens everywhere now, where before taking silt out of a river, we would actually survey the river to determine whether the silt was a problem or not. Because silt getting into rivers is a natural process. It's how you end up with river deltas at the mouth of some rivers. It's the silt being carried down. The problem comes when the silt actually accumulates to a depth that it's reducing that it's changing the gradient of the river over its length. So if you put a weir in a river, you will immediately behind that weir, you will get slack water. It looks as though the river's running fast, but over the top, behind the weir itself, below the surface, there is stationary water. And where that happens, silt will settle out. So you'll always end up with silt behind a weir. Well, you could go in and dig that out every year if you like. That's not actually holding the flow up, the weir is. So if you want to make a difference there, you need to take the weir out rather than taking the silt out. And there are very few circumstances where we get silt in our rivers in the UK to such an extent and stable enough that it is actually the silt that's holding the flow up. The other problem was that around about the mid to late 90s, the regulations around waste changed, and we could no longer deposit the silt on the banks of the river, because almost everywhere that we were desilting, the silt was contaminated. If there's a road nearby running off into it, then it will have oils and various hydrocarbons in it. Before you can deposit it, you have to get it sampled, and if it's over the threshold, then it gets treated as hazardous waste. And all of a sudden, instead of being able to just dig it out and put it on the bank, you have to dewater it, get it dry, because no pits will take it while it's wet, load it onto a lorry, ship it off to a landfill site that's able to accept hazardous waste, and the costs just went through the roof. And the budget that we had for desilting, as a result of that, just didn't do anything like the work that it had in the past. So in summary, there are a few places where silt can contribute to flooding, but generally speaking, it doesn't actually have that much impact on the flow of the river.
Okay, thank you very much for that comprehensive response, and thank you, Brian, for raising Helen's point as well. We'll move on to Nikki and Jane, and there are some comments and questions in the chat as well. So Nikki, do you want to go first? You want to? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you. I thought the presentations are excellent, but I also think you need to focus on the actual people in Chesterfield whose mental health, possessions, property that no longer is valued, and what they feel. And I thought it was quite interesting. Our house was built in 1929. It's been flooded twice, 2007 and 2023. Never before. An elderly lady who lives in Spittal came along and she said, I remember at 6 being sat on the wall by my mother watching them dread the rivers. So certainly for this part of Chesterfield, it worked. Now, I do take on board what Ian said about the contamination of the water and the garbage that's been allowed to collect in it. And I appreciate that. But I do think we need to be aware of what it's like for people actually living in this situation. And of course, I do think it's to do with climate change a lot of the time, and I do think it'll get worse for other people. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Yeah, no, there's some horrendous, some people have been through the most horrendous experiences. I don't know if Debbie and Ian, you want to comment on that, or if that was just a sort of something to reflect on. No.
I would only really say that I would never downplay anyone's experience of suffering flooding. I've thankfully never had my own house flooded, but I have waded through people's houses during flooding on so many occasions. Directing flood response was a key part of my role. So yeah, I was out there and did it. And until you've actually experienced river water getting into a house, you can't begin to appreciate just how much damage it does and how devastating it is. And once people have lived through it, it changes your whole attitude. We had one of the rivers I looked after, one of a very little development in that particular valley, the Mimram Valley. There's an old mill building not far from Welwyn Garden City that two elderly doctors lived in, and we had a horrendous flood event, which, amongst other things, brought a tree down that blocked a bridge. And because it blocked the bridge, the river came out of bank and flooded straight across the road and into their property. And they literally opened the door one end and the door the other and let the water run through the house. We turned out in the middle of the night, got the tree out of the river, and the water subsided. They finished up, I think, with £85,000 insurance claim for the damage to the house. And I went back and saw them quite a few times. And it was the first time that it had occurred to me when they said to me, look, we've seen the water come right up our garden many, many times. We've lived here 30 years, but we've never had it in the house before. But now that we have, every time it rains, we're on edge thinking, is it going to flood us again? So yeah, I have every sympathy with anyone who has flooded like that. But it's a very, very slow process to go through, as I said in my presentation. To actually get to the point where you get a definite answer as to A, is anyone going to do something to prevent it happening again, and B, when.
Yeah. Okay. And I think Jane, another flood victim. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it was really good to hear Nikki speak because I live in Brampton East, very near the River Hipper on Alma Street West, and the Hipper is literally at the end of the street I live in. And I cannot express the trauma of being flooded. I mean, I just have absolutely, I think in my life, never experienced anything quite as traumatic as that in the rapidity of how it happened. And I think what I want to ask really are a couple of questions. First of all, we talked about the River Hipper and the Derbyshire Wildlife Trust. I know we're doing an awful lot of work there. But it seems to me, listening to the whole argument that you've both put so eloquently about looking at alternative natural flood defences that work with nature, that harness what nature gives us and teaches us about water management, just seems to me to be such common sense. I can't see why we keep building walls and that kind of thing and keep allowing businesses to dump rubbish in rivers, and we're not dealing with it in a way that works with nature. But I want to ask a question about the Hipper because it's a small river, and I don't know how it would lend itself to additional planting. Maybe we could introduce rushes. I'm not really sure, tree planting is something that would work. But the leaf barriers sound a fantastic idea. They sound, just a no-brainer to me that we should be looking at that kind of thing as well. And what I wanted to ask as well, because the experience of the floods, however awful it was, it brought a community together. I now know all my neighbours. We helped each other. We worked together. We cleared our houses. You know, we were traumatized together. We recovered together. We panic together now every time there's heavy rainfall. But we are a community that was, you know, working in unity. And it was really lovely to see on a human level that that is still possible despite the world we live in and the things we're taught to think and feel. And, you know, that I think is an opportunity for us now to come together on a local level, street by street, and maybe have wardens, maybe have, you know, something that as a community we can do as well, and have some input into the decision-making process. I saw that there's somebody on the call standing as a local councillor. I am as well. I'm standing as an independent socialist in the ward for Chesterfield Borough. And I'm really keen that local authorities are funding these kinds of projects. You know, it sounds astounding to me, and I know I'm probably being naive, that we're relying on charity and relying on putting a case to local authorities for funding that you would think for the communities affected would be a natural thing for local authorities to want to do, need to do, and they should be obligated to do. So I guess I'm really interested in hearing what we can do to put pressure in that direction as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, and thank you so much. It has been so informative.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Jane.
I think that's one for you, Debbie.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jane. It's so really good to hear just kind of your whole experience of it, really. Yeah, it's very much, you know, speaking to other people as well who are affected by the floods. It's that sort of constant fear that people talk about that really, oh, I just can't even imagine. I live on a hill, so it's not something that, but every time, you know, it rains, I am thinking about kind of what people are going through, knowing how terrified people are, and particularly with that feeling that there's so little action. So it's really good to hear that there's that kind of community feel. And I just wanted to mention, we recently did kind of a community event for residents around Renishaw and Eckington, and we have a load of resources from that again, which is kind of similar to the talk really, but it's kind of an exhibition style thing that we can put up in a community event and just talk to people about what it is and what we're doing. So if that would be something you think might be of interest in your area, then get in touch, and I'd be happy to kind of do that for you guys as well. Yeah, it is extremely frustrating that we have to be applying for funding for this kind of stuff. There are kind of big funding calls that come out from government, but from other areas as well, that are looking at natural flood management, and there is conversations going on around changing the way that government funding is allocated to flood projects. So they're working on kind of a new system which takes account of all of those other benefits you get from doing natural flood management, so that those can be part of the equation, which will hopefully also then help improve the amount of funding that goes towards natural flood management. So yeah, it's a really good question as what you guys can do as a community. I think it's the usual thing, you know, making sure that these conversations are happening with your MPs, making sure they know that that is something that people are interested in. We're doing as much as we can at the Rivers Trust sort of nationally to really raise the profile, you know, thinking about kind of water quality issues. You know, that's really come and caught the public's attention recently. And I think we need something similar in a way, if we can, to just really keep trying to raise the profile of, you know, what advantages natural flood management can have and the benefits it can have. Both ourselves and other projects really get volunteers involved in the work that they're doing, which again, I know not everybody is able to do that, but it can be quite an empowering thing for some people to feel they can actually go out and do things with their hands and see a difference. So again, I'm happy to speak to you about some of the volunteering and stuff that we offer. I'm also very aware that a lot of people don't feel that you know, people should have to volunteer, so I completely appreciate that as well. But, you know, if that was something that people would feel could be a benefit, then again, happy to speak to you about kind of volunteering opportunities and things. And yeah, as we develop hopefully more of these projects in the HIPAA catchment, then definitely we can keep in touch and let people in the area know so that they can get involved with ones kind of on the doorstep. But that will be in time.
Thanks, Debbie. We've come to the end. There's lots of interesting information in the chat. And thank you, another Ian and Joshua, who both seem to have a lot of expertise and have offered help. I would say that, there's obviously a lot of interest and sort of community sort of will there to do something in Chesterfield and probably other parts of Derbyshire. So, obviously, Debbie, we can get in touch with you or your counterparts in other Rivers Trusts. Please get in touch with Steph. You should have had an email from her with the Zoom link if you want to join the flood action group and get involved and do something practical or lobby, whatever. There's so many issues. I mean, in the chat, there's the planning issue about, building on floodplains, there's rubbish, there's all the sort of, issues that Ian talked about, duties and responsibilities. It's a very complex area. It's a massive subject. But, as a community, I'm sure we can do something, to sort of try and further this agenda. Steph, is there anything you want to say before we finish? Oh, you're on mute. No, you're still on mute. Okay, all right. Sorry, John, if you want to put it in chat. Anyway, if you want to put something in the chat, let's see if I can unmute Steph a minute. Hold on. But just to say thank you very much. Oh, there we go. Okay.
The button had slipped down out of sight. What I wanted to say was we have all your email addresses, and I was going to suggest that we followed up with sending you an email after this and inviting you to join the group, because I don't know, some of you have come because you've got a leaflet, some are on Facebook, you've come different ways. At the moment, we're quite a small group, but if everybody here joined, we'd be enormous. So if that's okay, we'll follow this up with an email to all of you, inviting you to join us and maybe inviting you to suggest how you might contribute. I don't know. We'll come up with some questions. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Give me a nod or a wave if you think that's a good idea.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And so sorry to but we're out of time, and sorry, I know we could have gone on all night with this discussion, but just want to say a huge thanks to Debbie and Ian, our speakers tonight, who gave such great presentations. So, you can react if you put on the react button, there's a little clap symbol, or you can just do that. But thank you very much. And thank you to all of you for turning out on such a lovely evening, and hope you found it useful. And I'll stop recording now.